Hello, everyone. It's a thrill and an honor to see you all and to join you for the summit. OnRamps is really just an amazing organization, and it's really been a joy of my life so far to be partnering with you in the last year. So what I want to talk about today is the developmental science of adolescence and share a little bit with you about what's been emerging from basic laboratory research and experimental research about how adolescents think, how they develop, what motivates them, and really try to tie a thread and draw a thread between that science and what can be done in the classroom. How can we make this developmental science useful for you, the young people you're trying to reach? As we all know, we have our work cut out for us this year with young people being asked to learn in new and different ways. And also just a growing awareness of the inequalities that face our nation. And yet, a theme of my talk is that adolescents are truly resilient learners, and that with the right appreciation of where they're coming from, we can really harness that resilience and creativity. So let's start with adolescents. Now, where do they come from, right? So what we know from developmental science is that human beings are born natural learners. We come into this world wanting to explore, wanting to figure out what other people are thinking and how objects work, and there's just rapid explosion of language and learning, right? And yet, by the time adolescents reach middle school and high school, we're often not surprised if young people have lost that love of learning, right? And what I want to propose is that sometimes the problem is with us as adults, with how we try to reach them. So I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, and I remember distinctly how adults tried to reach me and change my behaviors. So you might remember things like DARE, drug abuse resistance education, something that spread kind of widely across the country. This obviously is an effort to reduce drug use among young people. How do these programs often work? Well, there's like an assembly. Maybe they might hand out a DARE fanny pack. Maybe the person doing it is wearing socks and sandals. And how do young people react, right? They often kind of turn off and turn away from this type of approach. In fact, a number of evaluations of the DARE program found that on average it increased drug use in schools across America. Likewise, people have described the experience of being a young person as the big wait, right? That is that young people come into our classes, we ask them to learn, to advance their knowledge, and often we make the argument that if they dedicate themselves now, then in the future, maybe far in the future, they'll be able to use that knowledge for something. And it's a bit like the old marshmallow test that you may know about, right? Where you're asked to delay gratification, to not eat the marshmallow now so that in the future you might get several marshmallows. And adolescent developmental science teaches us that that is not really how adolescent brains work. There's a real challenge in delaying gratification now for the sake of things far in the future, especially when the reason for that delay is not transparent to them or even to us, right? So the equivalent of waiting for the second marshmallow for a high schooler might be factoring trinomials, right? Or other things that adolescents may be asked to do by adults without maybe transparent reasons, and may wonder what value it has for them. And adolescents, are often asked to take courses again and again if they don't immediately master it. Uri Treisman, a mentor of mine who we'll talk about today, often said that we started with algebra for all, we ended with algebra forever. So how do we tap into where adolescents are coming from more effectively? Well, one thing we can do is return to first principles. So a number of really important studies in anthropology have talked about how human beings crave social safety, right? In our evolutionary history, right, human beings relied on social groups in order to survive and thrive. The one story that people like to talk about is the importance of sleep to human survival. So animals, for instance, can fall asleep and keep their muscles rigid, so they can sleep in trees, for instance, or on the side of a cliff. That allows them to stay away from predators. Humans, when we fall asleep, you know, we're like a beanbag chair. We kind of we completely relax. That means we're really vulnerable in the night, and that creates an immediate need for strong social groups that we trust, that can keep us safe as we rest. And so somewhere buried deep in the human brain is this need for social safety. And it goes not just in how we can rest and sleep, which of course is essential for survival, but also how we gather resources, how we raise our youth, and so on. Given this like very basic, very fundamental need for social safety that's kind of baked into humanity, often our young people are entering schools at a time developmentally where social safety is threatened, right? So our teens, our high schoolers are bombarded with social comparisons, whether it's on social media or in the hallway, right? They often are asked to complete schoolwork, tests, and so on, and compare their grades and see, you know, in the implied message, at least in adolescent cultures, is that some students might be more worthy than others of success in our society, right? But also, as increasingly there's been discussion of in the national media narrative, right? Schools also might systematically exclude certain groups. So schools have often been a battleground for inclusion, and they can even threaten social safety for students, right? And the idea is that deep evolutionary root of the need for social safety comes into play in our classrooms, whether we're facing exclusion on the basis of race or social class, or just simply the idea that adolescents are apt to compare themselves to one another and may feel inadequate, and or they may conflict with the teachers in their classrooms. Let's look at some data from OnRamps classes. Does social safety seem to matter for achievement? Just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, over 7,300 distinct STEM students in OnRamps were surveyed about their instructors. Students rated the extent to which they felt included and safe and did not feel like an outsider in their classroom. This was a meaningful predictor of differences in final grades, right? So among students in classrooms where students were reporting lower social safety, the average final college grade was a 69. It was a 74 when students were reporting higher social safety. Now, of course, this isn't the only determinant of success in OnRamps, and my guess is that even in classrooms where students are reporting low social safety, faculty are doing a number of things to try to help students feel socially safe. And yet, a real challenge for all of us, all instructors at every level, including me, is to instill greater alignment between our desire for students to feel safe, to feel included, to feel supported, and the message that students actually receive. How do they actually know and feel that it's true, that they belong, that they're safe, that they're included, and that they're ready to take on challenges? Here's the key insight. If later on in my talk, a 4-year-old wanders in and pulls you away from the screen, then you can rest assured that you have gotten the main takeaway from this talk. Hopefully you stick around because we have lots of good examples, but this is all you really need to know. Contrary to the stereotype that teenagers are disaffected, don't care, are unmotivated, right, or can't be engaged, the developmental science of adolescence, rooted in neuroscience and hormones and in our evolutionary history, suggests that adolescents are ready to be learners, right? They are ready to rapidly figure out what it takes to be successful in society, in many cases more rapidly than adults who have already come to learn or create a version of success in their society. However, in order for them to take on the most ambitious learning challenges, they need to feel safe and supported in that learning, okay? So you can think of 2 dimensions. One is rigor. So maybe a student, this is the difference between right? An AB calculus or an introductory memorization task, right? So deep problem-based or project-based learning, right? Inquiry-based instruction, asking young people to prove equations, not just memorize equations, right? That's high rigor relative to more kind of foundational memorization-based tactics. But another orthogonal dimension is support. So support might be high when students can work with teachers and peers to solve problems collaboratively, when they have enough time to revisit what they've done in the past and figure out how to improve it, when there's a culture and a belief in the classroom that smartness can be developed, that it's not just something you have or don't have. But support can also be low. When students are told, this is hard, but just go work harder alone, right? When students are alone with the thought, I'm dumb at math, right? And you can cross these two dimensions. And of course, you may think of many other ways to think of high or low support. These are just a few examples. And you could start drawing out what it's like for young people in our classes as we ask them to meet our ambitious learning goals. And as a psychologist, we tend to think of this in terms of stress and stress responses. So the blue bar here is the rigor or the challenge of the class, and the orange bar here is the amount of support that young people have. Sometimes rigor exceeds support. When that happens, we know from a number of psychophysiological studies, adolescents are in a kind of bad stress state, what we call a threat state. This is a fight or flight stress response. The blood vessels constrict, pumps less blood through the body, less blood to the extremities and to the brain. Cognitive performance declines. Young people sweat. They have butterflies in their stomach. All those kind of bad anxieties that we know really well. That's when the rigor of what young people are being asked to do exceeds the amount of support that they get. Now, what society often says is that what we need to do when people are in this bad stress response is to decrease rigor, right? And the idea is you can make people not stressed if you just take away the stressor, if you decrease the rigor and get rid of the ambitious learning goals. And of course, sometimes that is necessary. Obviously, sometimes adolescents have eyes that are bigger than their stomachs. They're in 7 clubs and 19 OnRamps classes, and they're the president of a number of organizations. And maybe they do need to have some self-compassion and reduce the number of things that they're doing. But a lot of times, that's not what we want them to do. We don't want them to start disengaging and quitting what they need to do, in part because the demands of the labor market will be so high in the future, and there will be a tremendous amount of catching up for our students in light of the instructional loss in the last year. So ideally what we could do is we could maintain rigor but increase support. So how do you have this orange bar go up to the point where young people are getting the social supports in our classes, in OnRamps, that allow them to meet the ambitious learning goals? How can we give them the psychological safety, the social relationships, the culture and climate that allows them to meet or exceed our ambitious learning goals? So that is probably a goal that many of us have, and that's something that maybe makes a lot of sense. What I struggle with as a college instructor is, how do you actually do that? How do you create that orange bar and make it go up? And there's a real challenge, because often what we want to do to increase support is to do things for teens, right? Or to to just be intrusive in our support. But that's not really what the goal is. And so I started studying expert teachers, expert professors. And one of the things I did was to visit Uri Treisman's calculus class at UT Austin. And this is a little schematic this is not terribly novel. It's pretty common in education research, but I like to call it Treisman's quadrant. And the idea is that on the y-axis you've got the level of support, and on the x-axis you've got the level of rigor. In the bottom left, with low support, low rigor, there's not much to learn. And so the level of support maybe doesn't make that much of a difference. If you go to the right on the bottom, that's where maybe the class is rigorous, maybe it's really challenging, but the teacher's not really there for you, right? It's not a supportive environment. It's not psychologically safe. Students might feel threatened. It's a stressful environment for students. Now go on the left for low rigor and increased support. Well, there you might have an overly supportive, comfortable learning environment, but the expectations are low. We're not asking students to do things that are ambitious. The top right, though, is the Treisman's quadrant, or you really could call it the OnRamps quadrant, which is I'm giving you problems and challenges, inquiry-based instruction. It's worthy of your best effort, but I will walk with you until you master these learning objectives and these tasks, right? So it's finding a way to maintain the blue bar I showed previously at a high level and also raise the orange bar to the same point. So how do you actually do that? How do you get in Treisman's quadrant or the OnRamps quadrant? Not with motivational posters. Now this is maybe less tempting if we're not even having physical classrooms this coming year, although I suppose you could send people motivational memes to the teenagers' cell phones. But I'm not advocating nonsense self-esteem boosting, just to be clear, right? So the poster on the left says, if at first you don't succeed, try again, says American proverb, which feels a little generous. And it should be more like American platitude, I think, right? That doesn't create safety for students, right? It basically tells them if they fail, it's their fault. It's they didn't try hard enough. On the right, it says only positive attitudes allowed beyond this point. It might think, you might think, hey, this is supporting students' positivity. But what if there's like a negative kid and they see this poster, right? Is the implied message everyone else in the class will be having a party without you while you stay in the hallway with your negative attitude, right? And again, these posters, which I think are not effective, most likely, are examples of how the message intended by us as instructors is not always the message received by students. So how do we actually authentically get in Treisman's quadrant? Here are the three tips from the developmental science of adolescence that I want to share, although in learning from mistakes, there's a typo, so I apologize. Adolescents are ready to learn, provided that the challenge is accompanied by respectful language and respectful treatment, meaning and purpose, and also opportunities to reappraise fears, anxieties, and frustrations as resources for learning rather than as threats to your learning. So I'm going to show you at least one study from each of these. So the first is respect. And you might say, of course, I mean, who would be pro disrespect, right? And yet it's actually harder to truly respect adolescents than you might think. One of my favorite studies to look at this was done by my collaborator, Ron Dahl, who and his colleagues. Ron is a neuroscientist at Berkeley. And they did a study that I'm kind of amazed no one had done before because it's an obvious thing to do. And yet it just beautifully illustrates an experience that many of us have. So what they did is they had teenagers come into the fMRI scanner, into the lab, and they had the teenagers listen to audio tapes of their moms nagging them for things that they should have done. And then they just looked in the teenagers' brains and said, what's happening when your mom is nagging you and asking you to change your behavior, right? So here's an example of what a mom said in an actual quote from the study. So imagine you're a 15-year-old, you're surrounded by a magnet that's circling your brain, right? And then you put on headphones and this is what you hear through the headphones, is your mother saying this. One thing that bothers me about you is that you get upset over minor issues. I could tell you to take your shoes from downstairs, but you'll get mad that you have to pick them up and actually walk downstairs and put them in your room. You'll get mad if I tell you that your room is a little dirty and it just needs sweeping and dusting. You get upset if your sisters want to do something that you don't agree on, but three of them do and don't want to do it. You get upset too easily. You just need to calm that down, right? So what happens in adolescents' brains when they hear things like that? Well, first they looked at the affective or emotional network, and they compare the emotional network when adolescents are hearing the criticism as compared to when they're not hearing the criticism. And what you see is an increase in affective activation. So that's a sign that teenagers are mad, basically. What about the cognitive control networks and the social cognitive networks? So cognitive control networks are networks that are engaged when you're planning how to change your behavior, when you're thinking a couple steps ahead. So if teenagers were hearing this criticism and thinking, you know, my mom's got a good point, I need to change how I deal with my siblings and my shoes, then what you would see is increased activation in cognitive control. Furthermore, if the teenager was saying, I need to understand my mom's perspective more, maybe there are some things I need to re-examine about my own choices, then you would see increases in the social cognitive network. That's thinking about other people's thinking. What do you see? In fact, you see a decrease in the criticism condition in the cognitive control network, and you see a decrease in the social cognitive network. So what's the takeaway? When listening to maternal nagging, you see negative emotion and very little thinking about how to change, right? And this matches probably a lot of our experiences where we say again and again, I told you to do this, I told you to do that, you're not doing it. And it's frustrating for us as adults, and it must be frustrating for the young people too. And this is what I mean by what matters is how the young person is hearing and perceiving things. It doesn't just matter what we intend. Because why do moms say things like this? They say things like this because they care for the well-being and welfare of the young person. Just like we as instructors, as teachers, say what we say because we care for young people. But what the neuroscience highlights or reminds us of is that what really matters is how the young person is interpreting it. If they're shutting down the cognitive control network, then they're not going to be prepared to change their behavior. So what we decided to do was to take new samples of adolescents and randomly assign them to respectful language, asking them to do something they didn't want to do, or disrespectful language, asking them to do something they didn't want to do. And then we wanted to look at differences in behavior. So what is respectful language and what is disrespectful language? I won't show a slide on it, but there's a beautiful study done by Jennifer Eberhardt who looked at respectful language from police body cameras in Oakland. And so what she did is she looked at every routine traffic stop from police when they talked to people who had been pulled over, and they coded the language. Respectful language in those police encounters was things like assuming positive intent, apologizing for the inconvenience, asking people for their feedback, clarifying your intentions, being transparent, and so on. What's disrespectful language? Disrespectful language was presuming that the other person was criminal and had criminal intent from the beginning. Commanding language like hands on the wheel, right? So anything that demands a response right away without asking. Withholding information, so not sharing with the person who'd been pulled over what you're doing or why, right? And the side note in that study is they found that people who'd been pulled over who were Black were more likely to get disrespectful language when the body cameras were coded versus white people who'd been pulled over. So there are the potential for racial disparities between, in that case, adults. But we also think that in classrooms, it's possible that adolescents in particular might be more likely to receive disrespectful language because of these strong stereotypes about whether they're kind of ready for making adult decisions. So what we did in an experiment was we needed to come up with behavior teenagers didn't want to do, but that was supposed to be good for them, and then assign half of them to respectful and half to disrespectful language. Okay, so what's a behavior teenagers don't want to do? We thought a key thing is taking your medicine, right? Taking your medicine is kind of like doing your homework, right? It's do something that's a little unpleasant now so that in the future you might be off a little bit better off, right? And taking a small dose of medicine, especially preventative medicine, it's kind of like that. The problem is we couldn't do a study with real medicine because then in the disrespectful condition, people would like not take their meds and that would be unethical. So we had to make up a fake medicine, but convince participants that it was a real medicine. So what did we do? We chose the Australian yeast extract Vegemite. If anyone has ever experienced Vegemite, it's actually described as an indescribable substance. There is a very prominent either Yale or Princeton philosopher who has written philosophical tracts about Vegemite. It's called the Vegemite principle, and it's how human beings can't possibly communicate when they don't even share the same experience, and some experiences are indescribable. And and they use Vegemite as the example in that very serious and stuffy philosophical paper. Here, what we did is we told teenagers, this is a medicine that might give you vitality and energy and perhaps enhance cognitive performance far in the future. If it was taken consistently, would you be willing to try it at least today? And then we had them split into two different groups. So one is a respectful group, one is a disrespectful group. So everyone saw a video where the person said, hello, my name is, they introduced themselves. I'm a second-year medical student finishing basic sciences at one of the UT system branches. I'm here to, in the respectful condition, ask whether you might consider taking this medicine. And the disrespectful condition, tell you that you should take this medicine. So it's kind of like the maternal nagging. In respectful condition, you're a UT student, so these are all 18-year-olds in our study. So I figured I would explain the scientific reason why it would be helpful for you to take it. So it takes young people's own thinking seriously and respects, the knowledge that they have. Or in the disrespectful condition, based on what I know about medicine and disease, the smart thing to do is to take this medicine. Then there's told some people have reported this medicine is unpleasant to take because of the bitter taste. In the respectful condition, they're told you might find it helpful to think of that slight discomfort as doing your part to help others, because they're told it's a scientific study where their behavior could benefit others. In the disrespectful condition, they're told to try to ignore that. So again, if you've ever eaten a spoonful of Vegemite, it's literally impossible to ignore the experience. And if you don't believe me, here are some pictures of our participants eating a huge spoonful of Vegemite. And we actually ran a facial recognition software to code for the emotion of disgust. It was very high on disgust. Okay. It's a very serious experiment. Again, indescribable. What happened? Kids willingly ate about almost twice as much Vegemite when they were asked respectfully. So enhancing is the respectful condition and diminishing is the disrespectful condition, right? This is grams. When we look at whether they took the spoonful at all, it was a 2x increase, right? So what's nice about this example is that this is clearly something that doesn't feel pleasant in the moment, but could be useful in the future. And again, it's not the exact same as homework, but at least to some adolescents, some of the time, they might think that some of the work we ask them to do that's at least kind of basic or repetitive or foundational might not feel that thrilling. And yet when their basic needs are taken seriously by people in power in the classroom, respected by instructors like you, then they may be far more willing to put in the work that's needed to get ahead. Second thing is meaning. So again, when I visited Uri Treisman's class, I realized he never just gives students calculus work or proofs. He also explains the reason why those proofs will help them, but also why in the future, with that knowledge of calculus and mathematics, they'll be able to make a difference for others. And if anyone has read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he describes the experience of being a Holocaust survivor And what made the difference between people who survived in the concentration camps and the people who didn't? And his argument, which gave rise to a prominent psychological theory, is that a commitment to some unfinished work or some loved one or some social cause was what allowed people to bear the unbearable. And since that work, which was kind of philosophical in its aim, there has been a wealth of research suggesting that meaning, even from mundane activities, even from difficult activities, comes from pro-social contribution, which is defined as the feeling that work you're doing now might make a difference for others in their lives. And so when we give our work in OnRamps a purpose that's bigger than just what students get out of it, right? Bigger than you'll get a career, make money, or you'll get college credit, but you can use this knowledge to make some kind of contribution to something bigger than yourself. Then that imbues difficult experiences with meaning. And we think that young people especially crave meaning and significance, right? It's not obvious that they crave, again, delaying gratification now for self-interested gain far in the future, right? But I do think that right now young people that they have a strong desire to be significant to others, to people they care about, to their communities. And so we've been kind of obsessed with experimentally testing this idea. And so we published an experiment a few years ago where we created a purpose for learning by having adolescents tell us about a social justice issue that outraged them, and then tell us how, with deeper skill from the class that they're taking, they might be able to take a step toward making a difference toward that social justice issue. And we've tested this everywhere from, for instance, in A-Leaf outside of Houston with 7th and 8th graders, predominantly English language learner populations. We've tested it at high school across the state of Texas, at universities. And what we find is that in 20 to 30 minutes, almost all young people can write about something that makes them mad about the world, right? It's actually one of the easiest things to do, is to get 15-year-olds to tell you what's unfair. But then we can say, okay, if you had greater skill, how could you do something about that thing that makes you upset and frustrated about the world? Right after we do that writing activity, we say, by the way, here's a chance to practice some skills. And they don't know it's called this, but we call it the boring math task. And the idea is there's a computer program that we developed with Angela Duckworth, who's famous for inventing the concept or popularizing the concept of grit. And so the boring math task asks students to either do single-digit subtraction repetitively after we tell them, hey, it's good to have math facts fresh in your mind that could be useful in the future. Or, by the way, if you want, at any point, you can, goof off on the internet. You can watch LeBron James dunking. You can watch music videos. You can play Tetris. And secretly on the back end, we're tracking how much boring math kids do versus how much they goof off on the internet. And I'm sure no one on this webinar can relate at all to this experience, because I'm sure no one has checked their emails so far during the boring parts of my talk. But maybe you have some sympathy for other people who might have a similar self-regulation challenge. And you might say, about this task, well, why did you pick single-digit subtraction? We did that because if it was harder, there's actually some satisfaction in getting hard problems right. So we didn't want it to be intrinsically rewarding. We wanted it to be truly tedious. And the question is, when you think you're doing tedious math for a purpose, do you do more of it and goof off less on the internet? And is that true even for teenagers who we think often are tempted the most to goof off on the internet and not do their homework? What do we find? First, we find that in the control group, and this is a randomized trial, there's a decrease in math problems solved across the experiment. So from the first trial to the second trial. Furthermore, there's an increase in tempting videos watched. Right. So the more that teens were asked to practice boring math, the less they did, and the more they goofed off on the internet. The treatment, though, forestalled that decrease in math problems and also forestalled the increase in tempting videos watched. Our hypothesis is that an experience that seems like an exercise in compliance, my teacher told me to do this boring math, instead gets transformed psychologically into a source of inspiration or even a meditation. That is, I'm doing these things because I'm strengthening skills that are preparing me to be significant to others. And right now, you get to feel like a good person. You don't have to wait until you have a job 20 years down the road to get the payoff of this skill, or maybe not 20 years of their first job, but the eventual paycheck that you're aiming for might be 20 years down the road. We think it's kind of like if you've ever done volunteer service, for instance, making lunches for the poor, right? If you're being honest with yourself, you feel like a good person when you're making the lunches. You maybe even feel like a good person just for blocking the time out of your calendar to later go make lunches, right? You don't necessarily wait until an actual good has been done to people who you're trying to serve. Whereas when you're doing things for pay, you really wait for the paycheck before it really feels like it paid off, right? And that's what we're arguing here, is that teenagers crave significance. They're willing to work hard when we help them see the significance of that work. Now, this is maintaining self-control for boring things. What about another challenge that we're going to have a lot in our classes this fall? Asking for help. Could a purpose framing make adolescents feel less ashamed of having to ask for help? And we think this is going to be a big deal because young people are going to be more confused and more isolated when they're learning at a distance. And if they feel like asking for help means that they're either a burden or not talented or not good enough, then they may not do it, and then they may fall behind. So just a few weeks ago, Catherine Thomas, who's a PhD student at Stanford, published a paper on how pro-social messages destigmatize the need to ask for help. So you no longer feel as much like there's something wrong with you when you get help. And she tested this in the context of Kenyan cash transfer programs. So these are programs that transfer cash directly to people in Kenya. And it's a very common economic program. And yet a concern is that it's stigmatizing in part for people to be given unconditional cash transfers. So what Catherine did was to take the typical narrative about poverty alleviation, which could potentially signal to people in Kenya that they're being seen as less than in some way by people in power, and they framed the cash transfer in this way, or in the way I'll show you next. So here's the poverty alleviation framing, which is the control group. The goal of this poverty alleviation organization is to alleviate poverty and reduce financial hardship among the poor. This organization believes that people living in poverty should be given income support to help them meet their basic needs. The organization aims to help promote a decent standard of living among the poor and help them deal with emergencies. Thus, the Poverty Alleviation Organization gives financial assistance to people like you to help them make ends meet, etc. And then they give them 400 Kenyan dollars. And you might read that and say, that sounds pretty reasonable, but you can see how it comes from a position of power and maybe even a position of judgment that might not match the realities that people are experiencing and the values that they have. Here's the treatment group, the community empowerment group. The goal of this community empowerment organization is to enable people to help promote better futures for those they care about and want to support most. Right? So it's not you need help, you're in poverty. It's with these resources, you can empower your community and people you care about. The organization believes that people know best how to support each other and grow together if they have financial resources to do so. This organization aims to empower people to improve their own lives and those of the people and communities they care about most. Thus, the Community Empowerment Organization gives financial resources to community members like you to enable them to contribute positively to the lives of people important to them. For example, when people can invest in themselves, they're better able to expand employment opportunities for others, providing valuable services to their community, and so on. Right? So the offer of help here is not coming from a place of you are flawed and you need support. This is about empowering you to support your community. The key outcome variable in this study was kind of like the boring math task. People had a choice of 4 different videos that they could, or 6 possible videos they could watch, and 2 of which were neutral, 2 of which were entertainment, like football goals of the month, and 2 of which were skill building. So how much do you want to learn a new skill that presumably people could use to better their communities? What they found is that the community empowerment framing increased from 39% to 51%, the proportion of people who chose 2 skill building videos rather than entertainment videos. That is, that framing something in terms of a purpose of giving back to others destigmatizes the need to ask for help and causes, in this case, adults to choose and opt into training opportunities. So what does this look like in calculus class? Well, again, we can go to Erich Reisman's classroom and look at what he says in as captured by Paul Tuff in his book, chapter 8. He calls his students leaders like you throughout the class. He says, when you are leaders in your field, then you're going to be on city council, you're going to be in the national academies, you're going to be making a difference. He assumes students will be mentors to others now or in the future. And he's clear that the goal is learning for retention and future use, not regurgitation. And so this is how he couches his most challenging work. It's you're learning for a purpose. The final thing we can do is help students to reappraise their frustrations, their fears, and their anxieties. What does reappraisal mean? Well, you might need to know what appraisal is. So appraisal is the way that we name our feelings. That's all it is. It's our perception of what our feelings are. And reappraisal means that we think differently about our feelings. The best way to illustrate this is through an experiment done by Jeremy Jameson when he was a postdoc at Harvard. He's since done this with community college developmental math students and a number of experiments, and we have just replicated this effect here at UT and in a number of high schools. But let me show you the basic study. The study is called Turning the Knots in Your Stomach into Bows, Reappraising Arousal Improves Performance on the GRE. What he does is he causes students to think about that anxiety that they feel in their stomach, that they feel in their sweaty palms, the heart that's racing, and causes them to appraise or name that feeling as a positive resource rather than as a sign that you're about to fail. So here are exact quotes from the treatment. He tells them, when people are stressed or anxious, the sympathetic nervous system tells the body to release energy. This is in the good group, by the way, the one that's supposed to improve performance. This results in an increased heart rate, which is vital because it delivers oxygen to the brain. Thus, a racing heart signals that your body is moving blood to where it's needed. The SNS also affects breathing. Breathing becomes faster and deeper because of our body's need for more oxygen. Sometimes breathing can become irregular and cause harmless but unpleasant symptoms, such as breathlessness. Finally, SNS activation increases sweating, which cools the body to prevent it from overheating and allows the person to address the anxiety-provoking situation without collapsing from heat. So sweating during stressful situations is perfectly normal and helped our ancestors survive. During the test today, it's important to remember that your body's responses to stress are both helpful and normal. Please try and remember this if you find yourself feeling nervous. He goes on to say, in stressful situations, people feel increases in arousal, which are usually interpreted as anxiety. And he goes on to explain what that is. Side note is I once made the mistake of giving this talk in front of teenagers, and I don't recommend any of you give a talk about arousal in front of teenagers. Pick a different term, I guess. Then he goes on to say, people generally think that feeling anxious will make them do poorly. However, our research indicates that being nervous does not hurt performance, but actually helps because our body releases hormones called catecholamines, which are associated with better cognitive functioning, and so on. So what did he find? Well, he had students, again, this is a college study, take the actual GRE test in the lab, and they did better when they got the stress is enhancing appraisal. But then he also had them take the real math GRE 1 to 2 months later, and he found an increase from around a 700 on the GRE to around a 770 on the GRE, right? From a one-time message that students were able to practice immediately after they heard by taking a practice test. So this kind of result, small sample, feels amazing. Again, we've been able to replicate versions of this study again and again, looking at the body's responses in the lab. But the power of this idea wasn't really driven home to me until, again, I saw it show up in a lecture I witnessed one time early on in a calculus course by Uri Treisman. Here's what he says. Everyone in this class will struggle, no matter who you are. Questions are going to be flying at you that you can't answer. When that happens, you're going to experience stress. And if you don't understand that stress, you'll think it means, oh no, I don't belong here. I belong at A&M. Sorry, he's a UT professor, so apologies to Sergio and many other A&M people on the call. But in fact, that stress is an indicator that your understanding is deepening. It's not a sign you're not learning, it's a sign you are learning. And I want to point out two things. First, reappraising struggle as normal and not diagnostic of ability. And second, reappraising the body's stress responses as things that can be useful and maybe even helpful. So the summary is, how do we get kids in Treisman's quadrant where they're okay with high rigor? Well, we need to have psychological safety, and we do that by supporting them. And there are at least 3 things that we can do. We can, at every turn, try to respect where they're coming from, respect their knowledge, their abilities, their backgrounds, their culture, their values, their ability to think for themselves. Respect is it's a buzzword. It's sometimes hard to pull off, but it's almost magic when we do. Meaning is another one. And again, that sounds obvious. Of course, things should be meaningful, but we have to be honest with ourselves. We so often fall into the narrative that school is about degrees, credentials, grades, jobs, and economic success. And that is like asking teenagers to do boring math now because of 3 marshmallows they're going to get in 15 years. And that's just a weak argument with where adolescents are developmentally. But if right now we create meaning and significance for the hard work they're doing, then they really will commit. And last is, if they're dealing with that frustration in our rigorous project-based, inquiry-based courses and OnRamps, when they're getting critical feedback in our rhetoric courses and having to rewrite their assignments again and again, we can help them reappraise that difficulty as normal because the course content is demanding, and also maybe even a resource because your body is preparing for success. So this is clearly just the tip of the iceberg, and many of you on the call or in the meeting probably have many ways of having these ideas come to life more powerfully in your own classes. But I'll stop there and really just thank you for your attention. For those of you just rejoining us, everything was consistent with what you heard before. You might have had to leave and chase a kid, but I'm thrilled to be with all of you, and I'm definitely around if you have more questions. So thank you very much.